There's a big part of the message missing when it comes to talking about farm, estate, and transition planning. And that part of the message is what we can do as the younger generation to prepare ourselves for that eventual transfer.
Hey, it's Shaye, and you're listening to Casual Cattle Conversations. Whether you're a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Casual Cattle Conversations. If you're a longtime listener, thanks for returning, and if you're new, welcome to the show. Today, this is for anyone out there who is ready to take control of their finances and build their own path for the future, even if they face some uncertainty about how they will acquire the family operation or if they will be able to at all. So today we are visiting with Jessica Groskopf, and she is a very insightful individual who, in addition to her career helping farmers and ranchers in this area, is also a farmer herself with her husband. So a lot of what Jessica and I talk about today we're talking about her transition story. She shares different tips about how to establish emergency funds, what smart debt is and what poor debt is, and how you can distinguish between the two and make sure that you're making sound decisions in those areas, as well as investing in flexible accounts and other some investment information that's valuable. And then we also talk about some alternative revenue streams as well, and how those can be a tool for young farmers and ranchers. Now, as we dive into this conversation, I want you to remember that we are all in this together, and as Jessica will say at the end of the conversation, we didn't learn a lot of this finance stuff in school. A lot of it was learned through experiences, right? So let's dive into this conversation and learn about it together. Hey folks, are you looking to achieve more with your ranch in 2025? Introducing Move the Ranch Forward, a goal-setting guide designed specifically for ranchers. This practical PDF helps you set meaningful goals, create actionable plans, and stay on track even when the unexpected happens, which we know is often in ranching. It includes templates, strategies, and prioritization cheat sheets to make sure you're always moving forward. Ready to make real progress on your ranch? Download Move the Ranch Forward today at casualcattleconversations.com. All right, Jessica, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. I've enjoyed going through your social media posts and seeing some of the content you're putting out and how you are helping farmers and ranchers today in the Midwest. So to get started, because this is going to be a fun conversation, we'll be talking about some transition planning, but in a way that I haven't ever brought to the show before. So to get started, I'd really just like to hear why you are passionate about helping that rising generation of farmers and ranchers build for the future.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me, Shaye. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today. And part of the reason that I'm excited to have this conversation is I think there's a big part of the message missing when it comes to talking about farm, estate, and transition planning. And that part of the message is what we can do as the younger generation to prepare ourselves for that eventual transfer. And we know that we are in this time period where there's going to be a massive amount of wealth that's transferred from one generation to the next. Here in Nebraska, about 25% of the great wealth transfer will be agriculture assets. So when I think about that, boy, that's a big place to be. And that means that we as the younger generation need to start preparing ourselves. And the way that we can do that is starting to make some financial plans for ourselves, as well as getting our own estate plans in place.
So what you're saying is this rising generation, such as you and I even, we can take control of that, even regardless of if that older generation is being fully transparent or really having that full conversation the way we want to.
Absolutely. So a part of my story is that I'm married to a fourth generation farmer here in western Nebraska. And like many young farmers and ranchers, we were trying to have that conversation with some extended family members about what their plans would be because they did not have a direct on-farm heir within kind of their lineage. And so we were trying to ask, what does that plan look like for you? And they weren't willing to have that conversation. And so, like many young farmers and ranchers, we kind of looked internally, and it's a little bit defeating, right? When no matter what you do, you cannot get them to break open about what their plans are, or even discuss potential opportunities for you as that younger on-farm heir. So what my husband and I did was we took control of our own finances. And what we know about farms and ranches is that the majority of farmland or ranch land that's operated is actually owned by that operator. So when we look at what percentage of farmland and ranch land that's actually owned by the operator, 50% of that was purchased from a non-relative. So what my husband and I said to ourselves was, if there's an opportunity to buy this family ground, we're interested in it. However, we know that it's very likely that we're going to have to buy farmland at some point. And so we started to save for kind of that unknown opportunity that presented itself. Now, ultimately, what happened was that family member passed away. There was an opportunity for us to buy, and at 35 and 43, we took on our first 7 figures worth of debt to buy the family operation, or that person's part of the family operation. So I think it's a testament to young farmers and ranchers out there that, number one, you can do it, but we have to prepare ourselves for that long run game, and understanding that in order to be involved in agriculture, yes, we have to have cash, and we have to know how to build that wealth from a very young age.
So, you said how old you were when you made that decision to take on that debt and make that purchase that you had essentially been preparing for. At what age or time period did you really start trying to build wealth for that, just in case we have this opportunity? Or it sounds like you wanted that opportunity regardless of if it was going to be family or not. So how soon should people start building wealth? Is it when they're still in high school? Is it 18? Is it 20, 25, 30? Where was that in your story?
So the biggest key to savings and investments is time. So the younger that you can start saving and investing, the better off you will be in the long run, especially if we're going to allow that money to grow over a significant period of time. For me and my spouse, it was about at 5 years that we had been purposefully accumulating for that potential down payment for some property. And so that was a really nice timeline. Not everybody has that amount of time, but the earlier you can start, the better. We were in a really great position. We were pretty lucky that we didn't have much debt anywhere else. So it was easy for us to kind of really work hard at that opportunity.
Well, that's awesome. And I appreciate that, some people, we really only hear the frustrating part of transition planning sometimes. And, when you and I talked earlier, you even mentioned that a lot of people wouldn't view your situation as an ideal situation, that buyout. But you guys made it an ideal situation, or in a situation that worked for you at the very least.
Yeah, so I count it as a success because the options were for my in-laws who are in their 70s to take on the debt, to buy the ground that they've farmed their entire life, or for us to take on that debt and have that opportunity. And we really saw it as an opportunity. And I know, Shaye, you guys actually have a pretty similar story. So I'm curious to hear about your guys' story and how that worked out for you.
Yeah, so there was more transparency on the front end, I would say, with that. So listeners who know for a long time know that I grew up on I am the 5th generation to ranch. I'm only the 2nd generation really on the place, because my parents actually started their own place when they got married, which is, as the crow flies, 2 miles from where my dad grew up. So I grew up with a dad and grandpa who ranched separate, but were always helping each other. They might have shared some farm ground, etc. So separate, but together in a way. And then my husband is, I believe, the 5th generation on the place we're on now. So when he came back from college, he came back to the farm right away. He didn't find a job elsewhere. So he had plans of eventually taking over the operation. So he started preparing for that fairly young, and I myself, my parents and grandparents really encouraged me to also start saving and investing young too, even though I wasn't quite sure where I'd end up. But once we got engaged, the plan was to move on to his parents' place. And the conversation, even while we were dating, it was always, well, maybe in 5 years. And it didn't matter if it was a year later, it was still, well, maybe in 5 years. So when we got engaged in January, he was renting his grandma's old house in town. That's where we were still planning. And then a few months later, it was all of a sudden, we need to sit down and talk about this. And it was like, oh, okay. And it was actually, okay, as soon as you guys get married, here's how we have things laid out. It was very fair. Make sure you guys are okay with it. As soon as you get married, we want to sign the papers. Yeah, which was a little bit of a shock to me because I was expecting, a few more years. But it all worked out for the better. And my in-laws moved to town. We moved on to the farm. It's just something that all happened quickly. But they were very organized and in place with a lot of it.
Shaye, I think it's really interesting as I hear these stories from people across Nebraska and even across the country. It's usually not, it doesn't happen in the way you think it's going to happen. And so I think that's why these savings and investments on the personal side are so, so important, because you never know when that opportunity is going to present itself. And there's a quote from a book that I read earlier this year. It's called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. And Morgan says, savings is the hedge against life's inevitable ability to surprise the hell out of you at the worst possible moment. And what we're talking about are positive things. But as I think about, why should we save or why should we invest? It's that moment when mom and dad come to you and say, it's time to do this. Or it's that moment when a family member dies and you only have one or two options. And so as we think about this as the younger generation of farmers and ranchers, I can't encourage you enough to start now when it comes to savings and investments. Even if you don't have an ultimate goal, I think, Shaye, your story is very interesting, right? That I started saving and then investing, but I didn't know what that ultimate plan would be. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing that we can do is say, I don't know what this is for, but someday I'm going to need it. And so if I'm not going to use it and put it to good use today, I'm going to save that for down the road.
And that's something that, my parents and grandparents always said when I was in college, if I had a little bit to put away, and I mean, a little bit really, right? I was in college, but it was, we understand you don't know or see the full picture for where and how you might need this yet, but trust us, once you get a few years down the road, you will need it somewhere. And so that was a lot of the mentality. And yeah, so with that, in our previous conversation, you really brought up 3 main points, and you've really talked about one of them a little bit, and that's kind of this emergency fund theme that I kind of got out of your last statement there, where savings is this hedge against what those unexpected things life was going to throw at you. So do you want to talk a little bit more about how to set up an emergency fund, the why, and just expand in detail on that?
Yeah. Again, I think this is something that not enough people are talking about for farmers and ranchers. So if you hear most personal finance experts, they will talk about an emergency fund. And some of them suggest $1,000, others suggest a much higher amount. And I'm here today to say, start something. So $1,000 is a great place to start. With most farm and ranch families, I prefer that they have 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses on hand. So thinking about that emergency fund, that's where you can dip in when the transmission goes out on the family pickup or the family vehicle. That's where you can dip in if we didn't have as much income as we needed on the farm to cover some of those family living expenses. And what that emergency fund really does is it creates that hedge or that safety net that allows us not to go into bad debt, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and allows us to continue to move forward with our financial goals so that we don't get derailed when something unexpected becomes available. Now, that emergency fund needs to be in a really easily accessed account, but also we don't want it just to sit there and kind of rot. So we suggest that it goes into a high yield savings account or a money market account where it's earning a higher percentage rate than if it was sitting in your sock drawer or if it was sitting in a regular bank account, which is earning basically 0% interest.
So now, is that just an emergency fund for the farm? Should you have a personal emergency fund too? I mean, can you talk about that? Because I know some people, it's all one checkbook and other people have it split out.
Yeah, so that 3 to 6 month emergency fund for family living expenses is for the family. So that needs to be in a separate account, separate from the farm or the ranch business. When we look at the farm or the ranch side, we actually look at a different ratio, which asks us how much debt we have to pay off this year and how much cash or current assets that we have on hand. And we want that value, that's called the current ratio, to be greater than 1.3. So if you're working with a banker or a lender, they're looking at the very top of your balance sheet and they're going to be calculating that out. So keep your farm and your personal finances separate because they have different measurements of how much accessible cash or savings you should have on hand.
So what tips do you have for budgeting out for personal and family expenses? Because in a few interviews I've had in the past, it never fails. People always say your personal expenses are more than you think.
Yeah. So actually here at the University of Nebraska, we do some analysis of farms and ranches. And in 2023, the average farm or ranch in that database, their family living expenses or withdrawals were over $116,000 in 2023. Now, it's a little bit higher than surrounding states, which are closer to $90,000 to $100,000. But I think it's a really important conversation to be having with your family about how much is the farm or the ranch contributing to basically our family and what does that look like. Now, my husband and I are double income, no kids, right? So I have an in-town job. We don't have any children. Our family living expenses are well under that $100,000 mark. However, I also have this off-farm job that's contributing, right, to that family living expense that we do have. So I think it depends on how your farm or your ranch is structured. So you have to take into account what is the total income from basically all sources, and then again how much is being pushed towards that family living, and that will depend from operation to operation.
Is there a percent you encourage farmers to start with as far as of your farm, when you're budgeting for your farm expenses, start with this percent that can go towards the family living so that you are somewhat paying yourself for the work you're doing?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I wish there was an easy answer to it. First, we have to be profitable as a farm or a ranch business to contribute to family living. So family living, taxes, and principal payments come out of net farm income, and so we have to make sure that we can cover those items. There's quite a few farms and ranches out there who are actually not contributing to the family living expense at all. So I think it depends on kind of your philosophy. I really enjoyed your interview with Dallas Mount a few seasons ago, where he talked about the fact that your farm or your ranch, if it is profitable, you should be withdrawing some of those expenses for family living, but you have to be profitable first. So I would encourage your listeners to go back and listen to that episode as well, because it was a great outline of what we should be doing with our profit.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up because actually, well, for people listening, we're recording this on the 15th of November, but on the night of the 14th, so last night, I actually had on one of my Rancher Mind events, we talked about bookkeeping, but before that, we talked a lot about how to build a profitable operation because you need that foundation too. And so it's very timely that you bring that up.
Absolutely.
1 second, folks. I have an opportunity for you that you do not want to miss. Have you ever wanted to sit in on an industry-wide panel and ask other ranchers, feedlots, or packers questions about the beef industry? Well, I'm making that opportunity happen for you. This coming January, I will be hosting an industry-wide panel, and it is a part of the Rancher Mind series. So it is an opportunity for cattle producers such as yourself to submit questions. Depending on the group size, maybe even potentially unmute and ask the question yourself to these individuals so that we can come together as a group of cattle producers and the beef industry as a whole and have conversations that matter to us. Be open, transparent, and move the whole industry forward. So if you want more information on that opportunity and how to join us, go to my website and fill out the Contact Us form and just put Rancher Mind info, and I'll send you some information about how to join. But with that, let's resume back with our regular content. So let's talk about debt and smart debt and maybe bad debt, because you kind of led into that a few questions ago.
So again, as we think about traditional personal finance commentators, oftentimes they categorize all debt as bad debt. And I am here to tell you that not all debt is bad, and debt is certainly not dumb, especially for farms and ranches. Debt is a tool. What we want to avoid is we want to avoid bad debt. And this is something that I think most of us kind of understand, but I really want to put a good definition around what bad debt is. So bad debt is debt that has a relatively high interest rate. Most financial experts say anything over 7% kind of falls into that bad debt category. Bad debt is also purchasing items that aren't necessary. And sometimes if you ever see me teach, you'll notice that I put the word necessary in quotes, because necessary is a term that varies by the person you ask them. So we want to make sure that as a farmer or ranch family that we're defining what necessary expenses are for our family, and then deciding whether or not we want to go into debt to cover those expenses. Another piece about debt is that we're purchasing an asset that potentially depreciates over time and does not contribute income or efficiency to our business. So a perfect example of this is some people might think that a vehicle is bad debt, but we know as farmers and ranchers they're necessary for our business, and they increase our income hopefully over time. Now, a boat might be an example of something that depreciates but doesn't add value to our business. Another thing that might help us determine whether it's good debt or bad debt is whether the item we are purchasing has tax advantages associated with. So, for example, my home has a mortgage, right? That's debt. But there are tax advantages to owning that home. So those are just a few things that we can use to determine whether or not it's good debt or it's bad debt. And we have to be really thoughtful about the type of debt that we're taking on. So for most farm and ranch families, the primary thing that falls into bad debt would, of course, be credit card debt. So again, that credit card has a relatively high interest rate. The items we're purchasing may be necessary, but another piece that might come into this is the fact that by the time I pay off that credit card, those groceries are long gone. So there's some interesting components here as we think about debt that we need to think about bad versus good. Another thing about debt is we can have a bunch of good debt, which can put us in a bad financial position. So we also need to make sure that we manage the debt load that we have, both on the personal side as well as on the farm and ranch side, and that we know we can service that debt not only on an annual basis, but also on the longer term.
Awesome. Thank you for kind of diving into that. You explained that really well. Now, if someone's listening and they want to take a look at everything that they maybe already have, because finances can be overwhelming, what tips do you have for looking at their debt, their current financial situation with a set of open eyes to see where they're actually at so they can move forward?
So the lucky part about most farms and ranches is that we probably have an operating loan with our bank, and that bank requires us to fill out a balance sheet every year. typically on that balance sheet, we are asked to list all of our business debt as well as our personal debt, as well as the assets that we own. So that's actually a really good place to start, is to go back to your balance sheets and start looking through that information. If you get back to a few pages back, past that cover page of your balance sheet, that should detail out all of the details of your loan. So the amount that you borrowed, which we call the principal, the amount of interest that debt accrues on an annual basis, which might be listed as the APR, and the length of that debt or the term of that debt. So that really kind of gives you a summary of what kind of debt that you have. And if it doesn't have a complete picture, I would encourage you then to just start making a list of all of that debt that you have. Okay. Now remember, not all expenses are debt, right? So if I have a utility bill that comes in and I'm able to pay that immediately, right, that's not necessarily a debt unless it becomes past due. So I think it's sometimes overwhelming to think about what truly is a debt versus what's just an expense. And again, remember that debt is that money that we borrow and that we have to pay back through some sort of a payment plan.
All right. So let's talk a little bit more about investing. And I know you and I have talked previously, and you like to talk about flexible investing, and you talked about that with those emergency funds too. So can you talk a little bit more about maybe what types of accounts to be investing in, what you recommend there for those who are building for the future?
Well, let's take a step back and let's separate savings from investments. So I think as farmers and ranchers, when we hear the word investing, sometimes it makes our heart flutter a little bit, especially if we're talking about traditional investing in some sort of investment account. So let's go back to savings. So savings really is that opportunity for you to put money into an account, usually a traditional bank account, right, where you're accumulating a certain amount. And most of the time, again, those accounts, if I'm just going down to my local bank, really the amount of interest that you're earning on those savings is very little. It's very, very small, less than 1%. So what that means is that money that I'm putting into those accounts is actually losing value. Now, why is it losing value? The reason it's losing value is because the value of that money is not keeping up with inflation. Right? We know that if I spend $1 today and I spend $1, 6 months from now, that I probably can't buy as much with that $1 6 months from now, right? That's the effect of inflation. So when we think about savings, if we're just putting into these regular savings accounts, we are not keeping up with inflation, let alone earning more. So we have to turn our attention to investments, right? So investments have a higher interest rate. So the easy one is to step up to that high yield savings account. Earlier this year, it was earning around between 4 and 5%, okay, versus my less than 1%. So right there, we're stepping up and saying, here's an opportunity for me to have a better return on my money, at least outpacing inflation for right now. And we know that value of that money is not deteriorating over time. Now, that high yield savings account or money market account would be the other option there. It is not necessarily in the stock market. It's just a higher percentage of return on those accounts. Now, we can step up a little bit higher, maybe to something like a bond, which would provide us the opportunity to have a known earnings rate based on the length or the term of that bond. So those are really safe savings methods that we can use as farmers and ranchers. The one thing I will say about the bond is the difficult part about that is it's not necessarily accessible when you need it. So we have to lock that money into that bond for the entire term of that bond. So that's the one drawback to that piece, but we do know that it's an investment vehicle that a lot of folks use. So then when we step up a little bit higher, a lot of personal finance experts start to talk about retirement accounts. But for farmers and ranchers, that usually is not somewhere we want to put our money because we might need access, like Shaye and I needed, to purchase property kind of at the drop of a hat. So what we're looking for if we want to step up into a higher return, somewhere in the 8% or greater return, is we're going to have to look for investment accounts that allow us to access those funds. Now, we don't want to put money into investment accounts unless we are going to leave it there for 3 or more years. Okay, so we want to have that money grow over time, and usually about that 3-year mark is where I say, okay, does it need to go into savings or does it need to go in investments? If I think I'm going to use that money within 3 or so years, I'm going to put it into a savings bucket. But if I don't have a plan for that money, or I know that that opportunity is more than 3 years away, I might look at an investment bucket. So when I look at the types of investments that are out there, what we're looking for is something that we can contribute to and that we can withdraw without penalties and with as little taxes as possible. Okay, so if I put into a 401k, it's very difficult for me under the age of 59 and a half to withdraw those funds. So that's probably not where I'm going to put that money. Now, there are some accounts like a Roth IRA where I can withdraw any of those contributions that I have made. Now, if your head is spinning and you're like, Jessica, what are you talking about? I would encourage you to sit down with a financial advisor and explain your situation and say, here's what we're looking at. We would like to invest for more than 3 years. We need this kind of access to those dollars, and they will help you pick the right account.
So you mentioned safe places to invest your money. What did you mean when you said safe?
Yeah, so I think a lot of farmers and ranchers think that investing is risky. And I will say kind of the stock bro, investing is risky, right? The cryptocurrency, the picking specific stocks, that is inherently risky, right? Because you're putting kind of your bet on one item to perform well or not to perform well. But if you are selecting the right accounts where you can still access those funds and you're selecting the right investments within those accounts, most of the time we're picking something that is a overall picture of the stock market, like an index fund or an ETF, where we're not just betting on one company doing well, we're betting on the market doing well overall. And we know that over the long run, we are much more likely to have a positive outcome on that. Okay. So, yeah, that short-term versus long-term is part of it, but also making sure that we have a really well diverse portfolio that we're selecting fund from, and usually that is ETFs or index funds. So I do want to make one more comment about investing, and that's the fact that when we are investing, it's a 2-step process. So once we've selected the correct investment account, again, that's flexible and that we can access easily, the second part of that is selecting the investment within that account. So make sure that if you are working with a financial advisor or you're doing this yourself, that you make sure it's not just putting money into the account, it's making sure that that money is assigned to a specific investment.
All right. So we've talked about emergency funds, smart debt, and investing in flexible accounts. But one thing that's been brought up by other podcast guests, some of my Rancher Mind members, and even just friends of mine is those alternative revenue streams. And you even brought that up yourself, that you have a town job, and that's in a sense a part of your risk management too. It is for a lot of people. So I guess, what is your take on that alternative revenue, whether that's different revenue for the farm or ranch is bringing in, or if it is a town job or another business, as far as helping young people build for the future?
So again, I think it depends on the structure of your farm or your ranch business. But with the farms and ranches that I've worked with, I see that most of them have some sort of second income or third income. Like you said, whether that's from a retail sales business or whether that's from someone having that in-town job. And I think it is important for us to consider, what does that look like? Now, I'm someone that says that has to fit with the farm or the ranch, right? So if you've got a retail sales business, you've got to make sure that it fits with the seasonality of farming and ranching, or if that in-town job provides enough flexibility for you to be able, again, to come back to do those tasks that need to be done. So I think there's a lot of considerations, both financial and non-financial, that need to be considered when we look at alternative sources of income.
Absolutely. And I know that's something like this podcast, my Rancher Minds, my freelance writing, all of that, that is very flexible, which is why I really enjoy doing it, because it complements me helping on my husband and I's place. I can still go up and help my parents where I still have cattle, so that's really nice. And then my husband is an independent crop consultant, so that's nice too, and complements a lot of what we do, even though sometimes it does add a little stress to our busy seasons on the farm too, because there's always stuff going on. But it's been a great tool for both of us. Okay, Jessica, so if someone out there listening to all this information we shared is feeling maybe a little overwhelmed by finances, because finances can be overwhelming in general some days, or maybe they even have a lot of emotion tied to the operation. And when you tie finances to emotion, it just can be really messy. So what could maybe be some of those first steps for someone who feels overwhelmed by all of this to start taking control and building their path and building their own future, even in the uncertainty that they may face?
So the first thing is, I want you to take a deep breath with me. You are fine. No one has taught any of us how to do this finance stuff, right? They didn't teach us in elementary school. They sure as heck didn't teach us in high school. And some of us maybe learned a little bit in college, right? But it's not something that you should inherently know. If you're overwhelmed, I would start with going back and listing out everything about your finances. So go back to that balance sheet, start to write things down, and start to understand what you do and what you don't have in place. Then I would work with your local banker or a financial advisor and just be very honest with them. I want to learn more about how to accomplish X, Y, or Z. How can we move forward? And having someone who can help you is wonderful. Now, if you don't have somebody in your community that you're comfortable reaching out to, you're always welcome to reach out to me. You can find me on Instagram at Jessica_Groskopf, where I talk about all of this stuff and more, and I'm happy to work with you.
All right. Well, and I will include your social media handle and information in the show notes for anyone who has questions. Folks, thank you for tuning in, taking time to listen, and if you are taking steps to build your own path to the future, congratulations. Remember, the best way to support this podcast and other podcasts is to leave a rating or review, and if you found it valuable, share it with a friend who might also like this information. But with that, happy ranching, folks.